One of the reasons I wanted to read the chapter on kinship and those kinship diagrams and relatedness before we did the chapters on race and ethnicity, and especially gender, is because this was an interest. It was an early interest of those anthropologists. They got really into kinship, and they got really into charting people's kinships and making those circles and triangles and lines and trying to figure out things. And as we talked about in that section, they basically began with maybe a society, maybe not the anthropologists themselves, but certainly society at large had this idea of what we might call heteronormativity, that the circles and the triangles are supposed to get together, and that's the way things should be. Boy, that's a long word. And here's another long word that Guest introduces, although he didn't make it up himself: cisgender, which I'm always confused by. But Tiana, what's that? You said you were happy you brought that up. Now you're not so happy.
No, I just think it was important to bring up. But in my post, I was talking more about like how the idea of cisgender allows like other gender identities to be situated according to that, because especially, well, at least in like Western cultures, cisgender is usually the dominant one.
Yeah, if I understand correctly, it's it's the idea that people who are super comfortable with being whatever gender has been assigned to them, and it's a kind of, I think you put it as, it's a term that's used to kind of call attention to that fact, in the same way that we are trying to call attention to whiteness as this default category that gets away with being unmarked because nobody's ever called them out for it. Called me out for it, let's say. So now I have to at least acknowledge that I am also, I think, if I'm not mistaken, we're going to read about, Guess is going to tell us about, for example, constructing heterosexuality, right? How you are taught to be heterosexual, right? And so it's like, people never thought about it that way. We just assume that's the default, right? We just assume this is the way things are. And, we don't have to worry about it. By naming it, then you're like, okay, that's an issue. Yeah.
It's really funny you say that, because I've talked to many people online who literally think cis is a slur. They say, I'm not cis, I'm normal.
Well, well, maybe it's working then. I don't know. Yeah, like I said, so that's, anyway, we'll just use that term. So what we talked about in the kinship chapter is what anthropology found is not this at all. We found, I mean, there's plenty of people who have, who are heteronormative, but we also found all kinds of different ways in which people do kinship and get married and family types and all these things. And all right, this is, I haven't figured out how to put this. I don't know if I'm doing it right, so don't get down on me. But like, it's like a lot of times people will be like, they'll walk out of class and be like, oh, I've never seen that before. We are so gender progressive today, right? And they say that people are doing these weird things now. And I guarantee you, whatever you think is strange today, if you think anything's strange, but if you think something's strange today, people somewhere else or back in the past were doing stranger stuff. Like the stuff we're doing today, nah, it's not that weird. There's something weirder out there, and we can talk about it, but I don't want to freak anybody out. Now, there were some anthropologists back in the early days, we've talked about a couple of 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict, they were actually going against the heteronormative trends. For one thing, they both identified as, well, they probably would have been fine being cisgender women, but they also were fighting against sexism in the academy. they were not able to rise as far as they might have. They became very popular as anthropologists, much more popular than some of the guys who did get highfalutin academic institutions, but they weren't accepted necessarily within their academic rank. They also had a long-term same-sex romance between them, and so they were actually very interested in different ways in which other societies could offer us social possibilities. So from a pretty early on, Margaret Mead's book Coming of Age in Samoa was sort of revolutionary, and I mean almost everybody had read it in its day, in terms of telling us about different practices in another society. But I really want to pause here and just give a shout out to the feminist anthropologist and feminism in general from the 1970s that really started to rework some of the kinship data. So instead of just considering that, oh, people in this society are weird because they get married differently or they have different kinds of families, what they did is they said, wait a second, not that we want to adopt those possibilities, but that means people can do things differently. It means different worlds are possible. It means we don't have to live in this one, we can maybe do something else. And so what they drew attention to is that these kinship systems and these marriage systems and these ideas about who should do what were actually part of systems of power, which in many cases, and of course the feminists were at that time primarily concerned with male dominance and trying to adjust to that. But they found a lot of kind of support from going back into other societies or historical situations and being able to look at the data again and say, no, this is not just some curiosity that some anthropologist dug up. This is something that we should take seriously as a way to think about how a society could be differently configured. Again, we're not trying to copy other people, but we're trying to open ourselves up to different possibilities. So this became part of what I would call another of the biggest moments of anthropology. We had a biggest moment, but it's not anthropologists who did this. So I have to say around anthropology, because there were anthropologists involved, but it was probably more a product of the 1970s feminists and in various disciplines getting together and figuring some stuff out, which is still super cool. Wait, who wants this one? This is what this chapter is about. The biggest thing of this chapter. Almost all of you said this is like thing that Guest did well in this chapter. Yeah. Huh? Oh, he does better with that than we expect him to. And we'll talk about that later, and I'm glad, but almost nobody mentioned that, only you, and you'll be called upon to do that soon. Yes.
Separating sex and gender.
Separating sex and gender, right? So that's what the feminists did. And yeah. Sadly, PJ, the feminists were famous for not being intersectional enough at the time, especially the white feminists, but they weren't the only feminists. Anyway, basically, that gender, all of those social meanings, expectations, roles, things that we expect of people when we think that they are a certain biological sex. I'm just going to put it this way. I'm not sure if Guest, I think he says something like this, that those, in terms of how we behave and what our ideas are about people and what kind of jobs we can get and what kind of occupations in society we can have, that our social expectations, what we call gender, are actually more important than biological sex differences. And so, yes, the feminists were separating the social ideas from the biological ideas and coming up with two different words for those. When we're talking about the gender, we're going to talk about the social stuff, talk about sex, talking about biological differences. It's in some ways kind of like what anthropology was doing with, you'll notice, with like ethnicity and race a little bit, or certainly with culture and race. but not quite. It's kind of like that. Now, I want you to be careful of two things. For one thing, just like we talked about with biology and race, nobody's saying that there are not biological sex differences within the human population. There's plenty of biological sex differences. They might be big, they might be small. I don't know, but you're not, by calling attention to our social expectations, nobody's trying to say there aren't differences. So people get weirded out when anybody says it's a social construct. That doesn't mean the people aren't different biologically. And it doesn't mean it isn't real. It has very real effects in the world. The other thing we have to be careful of is everybody got very excited to say gender instead of sex. And so, for example, my grandmother doesn't want to say sex. She says gender. So she says sex, and it sounds like that other thing, sex. Right? So people often will say gender when they might say sex. My best example of this, never do this. The gender reveal party, right? Where you go out to somewhere, usually you have to load up a cannon for some reason. Boom goes the cannon. Usually I only read about it when things burn down, people die. So, you know, I wouldn't really recommend this. I mean, maybe you can do it in a in a safer way. I'm not sure why, but it's
Really cake, but yeah.
cake.
I had to do a report in high school on how people died from one.
Yeah,
Like,
that's
it's shot
right.
and killed,
Yeah,
like,
no,
3
it's,
people.
yeah,
That was
no.
really fun.
What is with the gun ones?
I like the soccer ball ones, the soccer ball, baseball, those are fun.
I saw one on the fucking plane, that shit cracked.
Oh, the plane, yeah, the plane ones, yeah.
I like a plane to let out.
Anyway, I don't want to get down on these, but they should really be called sex reveal parties. Because what you're doing is you're saying, I saw on an ultrasound, I saw something, and I'm going to reveal that sex to you. You're not revealing the gender. You might decide on a whole different gender later on, right? If you called them a sex reveal party, though, a whole different crowd would show up. It would be wild. I don't know. I don't know if things would burn down or not, but anyway,
It would certainly get hot.
there you go. Yep, that's why I told you I should turn on the AC. You wouldn't let me. All right, so so in this class, in this text, we learn about how gender is actually culturally constructed, or how we build on these social expectations. And we expect people to do things. You all have experienced these. So, I thought this section on the sports was really interesting. And, I think maybe you've experienced this in your life, how people get challenged or channeled into different athletic expectations. And we've seen how, like, now if you go to like the women's NCAA, they'll only give them like 5-pound weights and won't even have a workout room. I think hopefully we're starting to get beyond this stuff. But I thought about it. I was also thinking about it in terms of like, in the old days, it was pretty traditional to give boys protein in their meals and give girls more carbs and sweets, because it was thought that the boys needed to go out and do physical labor. And if you think about it over time, that's actually going to result in very different body formations. And so when we say things like boys are usually stronger, like some of that has to do with the foods that were given to them and the type of activities which they're encouraged to participate in. So actually the cultural construction of gender, actually just like the cultural construction of race, can have very biological effects. And if you mellow those out, then maybe boys and girls don't end up looking as different as they might have in the past. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, like, for example, we call sexual dimorphism, like weight differences between average weight differences between men and women, has actually gone down over the years as we started treating people differently. The other part that the guest talks about is something that has become a big deal in what is called gender studies, is how gender is something that we also perform. And so this is getting into the idea that we enact a certain gender. We are in some way, not that you're acting it out, but it is something that when you do, the audience, you might say, we often reward good performances of gender and penalize what we consider bad performances of gender. I'll give you an example. It's an article I sometimes like to assign. It's a little old now, but it talks about this thing that the author calls doctor fits. So I don't know if you've seen those shows like, I don't know, ER, right? So, you come into the emergency room and all of a sudden the doctor comes in. He's like, I need a scalpel now, and I need this and I need that, and he's throwing the instruments around and people are rushing around. And these are called, by the nurses, they're called doctor fits. The funny thing about them is, if it's a male doctor, they'll move on it and they'll zip around and they might get mad, but they respect it. They're like, yeah, good job. But if it was a female doctor doing the exact same thing, the exact same performance, you might say, slow it down. Wouldn't give them the scalpel, get all mad, say bad words about that doctor behind their backs, right? And so this happens a lot in society. It actually happens with professors all the time. Same professor, different professor, same style, maybe, but gets rewarded differently based on what is the expectation of that. So a lot of way too many B words get passed around about certain professors, right? Whereas if I act the same way, I don't know, I might not get rewarded, but you're not going to penalize me as much. All right. Oh, yeah, Amy.
I didn't know you today.
I know, it's a long day for you.
It really is.
Yeah, and next Tuesday is going to be long too. Yeah, it's already long. You already teed that one up. What do you learn about this?
I learned that in Mexico. I don't even know how to pronounce it, so I'm gonna try, but Eskimo is like kind of defined person to person. So there is like a male masculinity type thing, but it varies from person to person in Mexico.
Yeah, this is a really interesting study by Matthew Gutman. He actually took this picture of a man carrying, holding a baby. And he went around to all kinds of people and asked, like, what do you think this is? And people interpreted this differently, but nobody thought it was weird. And so what he was saying is, like, from the outside, we often have this idea that machismo, or being macho, means, bravado, drunkenness, having affairs, all this stuff. And what he was saying is it actually has a lot of different meanings. And it can mean simply providing or being a good father. It can mean not drinking as much as, so it can have a variety of meanings. And often from the outside, we see one and we get all latched onto it because we like stereotyping people, but we shouldn't. And it was good field work, did a good job. So I guess I would say in some ways, and going back to the beginning, is that when we look at gender expectations and what people are expected to do, we can see, if we look across different societies, all kinds of things. And we can also see differences within societies. So that's what the machismo example is about, is even within the same society, there might be different expectations of what it means to be masculine or what it means to be feminine. And also these expectations change over time. They are historically variable. A student told me once, and I think I believe it, I looked it up, that in the old days, boys wore pink in this country and girls wore light blue. And the reason for that is that red was seen as a masculine color, red, fiery, hot. And so boys were to wear pink. And blue was seen as calming and feminine, and so little girls should wear light blue. Now we reversed it all, but it goes with this idea that historically, even in our own society, we've seen changes over time, and this happens in other societies as well. Now that we know about all this wide range of gender expectations, I want to talk about the social, again, the social categories of gender. Now, like I said, in the next class, we're going to talk about sex and biological sex. But the question becomes, wait a second, if gendered expectations are given to us by society, does it have to be only two? No. I guess I've answered that in the negative. I've answered the positive. Yes, there can be more than two social genders. In fact, Josie, there's a very famous, perhaps the most famous of all.
The Hijra of India.
Yeah. What do you know about them?
Well, there's sort of a subculture that has existed in India for like thousands of years at this point. And they're based off of, they kind of have like their own representative deity. I forgot how to say the name. But anyways, they sort of had their own communities and lived on sort of the fringes of Indian society for thousands of years and have their own culture and have sort of a place in Indian society where if you don't give money to a Hijra, they'll like curse you, for example, or if your baby's born, you might have it blessed by a Hijra or stuff like that. And they're not really considered, well, it kind of depends. Most of them take up the cultural role of women, for example, but many of them are considered neither male or female. Some of them are actually intersex, but that's more a minority than what's, taught.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm not mistaken, I think most are born biologically male,
most are
but
born male,
but take on a
they
social
take
role
on-
that might be women or might be a third category. Yeah, and
usually
so,
women, but
it's yeah, because and so, I mean, the other example that Guess gives is in native North America, in the indigenous societies of the Americas, are actually fairly famous for having both third and fourth gender categories. And so people who would be biologically born male, but would take on the roles of women or be in their own special category, might have a ritual role that would be outside of that, or sometimes biologically born female take on the roles of men or have their own special category. This actually passed into the end. Let's put it this way. The colonizers didn't like this very much. They were very interested in stamping this out. This was not a good thing for the imposition of European colonialism. So the way in which this was described by the French, some of the descriptions of this come to us from French colonialism, and especially what is now Canada. They described it using a word called berdache, which was actually a derogatory word for a male French prostitute. And unfortunately, that's the word that was used in the anthropological literature about this. And in recent years, a number of indigenous communities have tried to, in some ways, reclaim this identity by calling it a two-spirit identity, those that who are blessed with both spirits. Now, as Guess says, we have to be careful about romanticizing that, because there is some, actually, both in India and there is some pretty serious, homophobia, transphobia. So you don't want to romanticize that. But at the same time, I think a lot of that was imposed because people wanted to stamp this out and get rid of it for such a long time. There was a film that PBS put out, which was actually titled Two Spirits. And, they said that a lot of these ideas, there are actually societies that have 3 or more genders on every continent, and there are probably hundreds of examples. There's a few that are very well known, but there are many different examples of this. Now, again, we don't want to romanticize it, but I just want to point out that it is possible. Now, I want to get back a little bit to what the feminists were after, which was, what gender had to do with power. And like I said, when we talk, oftentimes in anthropology, when we talk just about cultural differences and the ways, all the crazy things that different people do, and we get excited about difference and third genders and all that stuff, we sometimes might lose sight of the power element. But that's what the feminists want us to keep track of, because remember, they're trying to address society. So in this chapter, Guest goes back and revisits an assumption or an assertion that was made, first formulated by the anthropologist Sherry Ortner. And here I'm using some logical symbols. I don't think I've seen these since the SAT. Propose the existence of a pervasive symbolic association of women with nature and men with culture, which was more highly valued. So the idea, as symbolically represented here, is that man or men are associated with the cultural world, just as women, in the same way that women are associated with the natural world, the earthy world, babies and breastfeeding and stuff like that, whereas men get to be more cultural and making laws and in public. And what she was saying is that this underlay the cultural logic of many different societies, and it was an explanation for why in many places there was male dominance. And I think this was a super interesting idea. I mean, it's worth thinking about for sure, but it really, once people sort of got out of the logical stuff and started looking at this more closely in the field, it became much more complicated, and it doesn't seem to work in many societies. And there was something missing here, PJ, that was very important in this chapter that we'd have to take into account whenever we're talking about man and woman and all these things. What else might we want to know about? Yeah. So we might want to know about, I mean, this is too abstract, it's too simple. So they needed more intersectionality. And some of the early, by the way, some of the early Black feminists did have it, and they're the ones who invented the term. They did have intersectionality, but they kind of got sidelined in our myth about feminism, but it would have helped. So it was good, yeah. Sure, why not? Yeah, shameless.
This year, the Feminist Alliance and Jobs, the first time it was the first one, and we just started, we're very intersectional, so everyone wants to join.
That's good. Back when I was in college, it was like becoming a bad word, but I'm told that the youth are re-embracing this word. So there you go. Join. I did say that all anthropologists should be feminists. I mean, they should be. Everybody should be. Right. Yeah, there you go. Along the lines, though, of how we think about gender and our stereotypes and how things are stratified, Guest gives us a couple of interesting other examples, one of which is a great article by Emily Martin, published back in 1991, which is a long time ago, but it's still great. If you ever get a chance to read it, you should. It was called The Egg and the Sperm. Gianna, what'd you get out of that? Should have signed it. I should have signed the whole article, but what'd you get out of it?
Oh. So with this article and the other example, well, okay, for this one, the idea of like the wording, especially in anatomy textbooks, and how it describes like the eggs as more masculine traits and the sperm is just like passive and waiting. Wait, no, that's
But yeah, exactly. Switch those up. Exactly. There you go. Yeah.
Sitting waiting for the sperm. And then also the other example is like the way we see history as the men were the hunters and the women as the gatherers. I was just talking about how the way that we describe those, like how our language also helps to inform like how we think of gender, and how, yeah, like so many other things are gender, but we don't really realize that.
Yeah, no, this was a fantastic article, because yeah, she went into those biological textbooks, which are just supposed to be They're supposed to be describing the biology. They're not supposed to be putting all these metaphors in, but they'd always be talking about these fast swimming sperm, like swimming up there and fighting it out, and the egg would just be sitting there all passive until the sperm who wins conquers the egg and fights its way in. Which turns out to actually be a total misrepresentation of the process of procreation. As I understand it, a lot of those sperm are just going off in different directions and they don't know what they're doing. They came in and then they get around, and then apparently the egg just seals them all off for a while and then chooses one of them. Now I'm putting in different metaphors, which obviously is not happening either, but you know, and then picks one and pulls it in. So the egg is actually much more active in this thing. But what she was saying is there's all these metaphors, and these apply to, you know, how people would talk about menstruation. Got to have a class with Emily Martin, and she talks about how during certain epochs of our history, we talk about menstruation like it's no big deal. So for example, in World War II, when we wanted women to be working in the factories, all these textbooks came out that are like, don't worry, you can still go to work if you're menstruating, you can keep on working, you can go there. And then it comes to be the 1950s when everybody wanted, you know, the guys were coming back from the war and they wanted to all settle down in suburban households. All of a sudden these textbooks came out, it's like, oh man, when you're menstruating, you're going to be laid up in bed for days. You can't work, you can't do anything. And then the cookbooks got longer and longer. It was like making a meal got harder because, you know, that's society. Yes, and the gatherers and the hunters, which we learn about in anthropology. Now, I've tried in my world to talk about the importance of gathering and how that often provided 70% of the calories in many of these groups. And I sometimes like to put gathering before hunting. But I will also admit that I was not as up to date as I should be on how much hunting has been done equally by women. And Guest addresses that, but it's even better now. This just came out in September of 2023 in a great set of articles called Woman the Hunter, the archaeological evidence has come out. And as Christopher Lynn, anthropologist, said, I predicted when I saw these talks that the papers will break the internet. Let's do this. So it's great. It is great. We have great evidence that, in fact, women were certainly hunting, did endurance trekking, all these things that made stone tools. All these things are normally imagined as being male. How do you think we did? Did we break the internet?
It's always been broken.
I mean, were we a success? Did we go viral? Obviously not. I mean, the 18 likes, I tried, look at me. I retweeted that, reposted it. Couldn't get it.
It's actually more like 17 likes because you liked your own post.
Oh, no, I liked his and then I reposted it. So he's got 18. The original one maybe had like 60 likes. We did not break the internet. And actually, Guest kind of talks about this on page 266. Kind of sad. Despite the archaeological, physical, and cultural evidence that anthropologists have accumulated to debunk the man, the hunter, woman, the gatherer myth, it is still a daunting task to shake free of the popular idea in US culture that men and women have some essential and essentially different nature that was shaped in our deep past. And I think that is true. We did not break the internet in the sense that we didn't go viral. And I am sure, even though I've been trying for 20 years and reposting things, hasn't shaken free these stereotypes. Maybe next year.